Hey everyone, it's been a few weeks, well, a couple of months I think, since I last posted a video. Had a request today from, I think it was Marco, to send, basically send the HTML emails from within CRM and convert them into plain text. So let me just open my Visual Studio. What I've done in CRM ahead of this is I've taken the standard email entity, and if I look at the fields, I've added a single custom field which is just a boolean, which is just called senders plain text. Oops, just click the wrong field. So it's a two option, so yes, no, senders plain text, and I've dropped that onto the standard email form just at the top here. So senders plain text, I've also dragged the direction on because I was only going to apply this if it's an outgoing email. So you could obviously apply the same logic to incoming and strip out the HTML tags, but obviously that's down to you to decide whether that's something you wish to have. I mean, it could be useful if you wanted to take the most recent email, for example, that's associated to a case and put it into the description, because obviously the standard description fields and note fields, note entity, are plain text. So if it's coming as HTML, you wouldn't want to just paste the HTML body, because obviously you'd have all the tags and surrounding markup, which would basically be illegible and unreadable. So yeah, I've added those couple of fields and published them on the form. So I've opened my new solution, which was just using the standard, if I click on new project, I used that standard new Visual Studio solution template, and I've just removed the Silverlight application that it added once it had finished adding the various projects and referencing them. I simply removed it afterwards. And all I've done since then is obviously strongly sign, so I've right clicked on each of the projects for the plugins and workflow, gone to signing, created a new key file so that I can actually deploy them to the platform. At the moment it's just using the default of the plugin assembly is registered sandbox, and the workflow is none, but entirely up to you if you don't wish it to be sandboxed or not. That's just the defaults at the moment. Obviously, in terms of debugging, if I wish to attach to the process, that'll obviously affect which process I need to attach my Visual Studio to. So I've deployed that. At the moment, there's obviously no actual business logic or any kind of plugins or workflows, but we're going to create a new plugin. So if I bring up my CRM Explorer, take a few seconds. Go to entities. So what we're going to do is, on a create of a new email, we'll trigger the plugin. What I may do for the purposes of the demonstration is also register it on a update, so that we can go into an email, edit the body, and see that it's actually altering the stripping out the HTML tags and so on. So if I expand out my organization, expand my entities, and find email, right click it, create plugin, pops up this standard dialog for what message type, and that obviously, because we chose email from the entities list, we can't now change the primary entity. But if you were adding a step to an existing plugin, obviously that would be enabled. So we can give it a suitable name, so we can just call it something like convert. So this is the actual plugin class name. So convert HTML to plain text or something like that. Doesn't really matter what you call it. So it's on a create of an email in the context of the calling user, and the pipeline stage will be pre-operation. So what we'll do is, as the message is being written, or prior to it being written at the stage 30 of the main operation, we'll alter the content of the description, and obviously then that will get written at the next stage without us having to do any kind of service.update, or if you're using link, obviously a save changes. So server only deployment, doesn't matter about execution, or if it's the only one in my environment that's registered, so it's not going to have a bearing on it. So if I OK that, so now it's created this is using the developer toolkit, it's created the sort of empty shell of this plugin, so it's obviously created the class inherited from this plugin base class, registered the initial event, so the stage 20 pre-operation and the create message on the email entity. Then it has a sort of new execute method that gets called from within the base class, which basically just passes in the local context, and this local context that's set up in this base class contains various properties, such as the plugin execution context, the organization service, and so on, so we can access those quickly and easily without having to do extra lines of code to declare them. What I tend to do is do a shorthand equivalent, so rather than having to reference like local context or organization service every time we want to do a organization service call or method, I just do a shorthand version. So after this to do, I'll just declare a new reference type just called service and just set it to point to the same memory pointer in memory as the local context does. So that's the organization service, and then for the context, just give it a shorthand name of context, and then this likewise use the plugin execution context property. So then we want to set up an empty entity, which we can then, this is our late bound type that will represent the email that's being created and for the purpose of the demo updated. So we'll just call that entity equals null, so initialize it with nothing. Then we need to do some checks on the input parameters of the context to check for the presence of a target object and that the target is of type entity. So if I can do if context.input parameters contains, you can use contains key as well, target with a capital T, and context.input parameters, and using the square brackets it actually targets a particular input parameter. So by putting target within there, it's actually looking at the attribute. So in that attributes collection of parameters, sorry, a parameter collection, we're looking for the one called target, and we're checking that it is of type entity. So that is entity is a test of, is it an entity type? And if it is, then we can set that entity variable above this reference type to equal what's stored within there. So we need to cast it, because obviously being late bound, and we need to cast it to the correct type. So context.input parameters, and then the target object within the input parameters. Otherwise, if it's neither of those are true and it doesn't contain target and it's not of type entity, then we'll just exit the plugin with a simple return. So just exit without processing anything. I'll just set up the update message, so I can now shrink down the entities, expand my plugin assemblies, find my demo 2014 plugins, which is this solution. What I will need to do first is deploy it. So that's now in the register file, added this extra step for this create operation. So if we now right click the package and deploy, it'll build it and deploy the plugins and the workflow assembly. Obviously it contains this new class for the convert HTML to plain text plugin. So that's now succeeded. If I go back to the Explorer again, hit refresh, expand my organization, expand my plugin assemblies again, and expand my plugins assembly, I can now see that extra plugin, and it should have the create step. So we'll add the update step at this point. So if I right click on it, add step, brings up a very similar dialog to what we saw before, except now the primary entity is enabled because it doesn't know which entity we wish to target, because this plugin could be registered against multiple entity types. So again, we're going to use email as the update message. Again, pre-operation, so if we subsequently go back and edit the message, it will call the same, it will call this update, and it will then be it prior to the main operation, so we can then alter the content of the description and then it just write it at the next stage. We'll only trigger it on the description. We don't want it triggering if someone changed the to or the subject or anything else within it. And then the only other thing, we will need a pre-image, because I'm going to put some checks in to see if the custom field, the sender's plain text, is set to true, and also the direction is outgoing. But obviously on the update, if the only thing that's been changed is the description, the message passed into the plugin wouldn't contain those fields, so when we did the tests they'd say null. So hope that makes some sense. So I'm going to set up a pre-entity image. The name's irrelevant, you can call it what you like. I'll just call it pre-image because it's fairly self-explanatory what it is. And the two parameters we wish to pass in will be the direction, so we can check regardless of whether it's been changed or not, whether it's incoming or outgoing, and our custom field, the sender's plain text. So this will take a snapshot of this entity and it will add in, sorry, the snapshot will only contain these two properties, direction code and sender's plain text. So now it's created that extra step. We can also see that within the register file. We've now got this extra step here, this pre-email update. I also need to go up here and just replicate this line, because obviously what this does is initial checks when the plugin's initialized, so in the constructor, and if the message that's being triggered isn't one of these registered events, it will just exit, and you wouldn't obviously know why your plugin hadn't done anything. So we need to replicate that line, just change the message to an update message with a capital U. So now it will accept it being called pre-operation on a create or pre-operation on an update. So now we've got the pre-image contained within the update message. We now need to do a check for that pre-image, and if the pre-entity images collection does contain one called pre-image, we'll iterate over the attributes, check if they're present in the email message. If not, we'll add them in. So if context.pre entity images contains, so this would only call this piece of code would only be true on the update message, because on a create there isn't a pre-entity image. So if it contains pre-image in this collection of images, then we'll declare another entity, call it pre-entity. Again, we can set it to null. So, and then we can set, well, we could do it in one, initialize it in one go. We could set the pre-entity images, one called pre-image, and cast that as an entity type to that new variable, this new reference type. So then we need to iterate over the attributes within that pre-entity image. So it's got a collection of attributes that it should only contain two that we've requested, which are the direction code and our sender's plain text attribute. So we iterate over those, and what we'll do is for each attribute as it iterates, we'll check if entity contains, so, or rather doesn't contain. So if entity contains attribute.key, so that's the name of it basically, and we obviously want it to be a doesn't, so we can put the exclamation mark, which is basically like saying equals false. So if it doesn't contain that particular attribute, we can set a attribute with the same name by just putting it in square brackets and using the key property equal to the value that the attribute contains. So regardless of the type, it will write that into that attribute. So if it was a date time, it'd work. It doesn't really matter because it's obviously late bound, so it's not type safe. So what that's doing is taking the pre-entity image, iterating over each of the attributes contained within it, and if the message passed in, the email message passed in that we've got stored in this entity doesn't contain that attribute, add the key value and add the value and set the value to equal to the same value. So therefore the email message would then contain, as well as the description, it would also contain the direction code and the value that was stored in the sender's plain text. So I've also, if you look over here, got this early bound class, so I've used the CRM SVC util within the SDK to generate my early bound types. Obviously because I've got a new custom field, I had to generate a new version of that class. So I can now cast the late bound type to an early bound type. So it's not a requirement, you could work with purely late bound, but obviously you need to know what each of the fields is called, and obviously the type safety comes into it, that you could pass values in or into a particular attribute and get the wrong type, and it would only crash at runtime because it wouldn't know at compile time that it was invalid. So if I just call that email equals, and convert our late bound type using the toEntity method to an early bound email type. So then I can do a check if that email, so I've got my sender's plain text value, so does that equal true, and is the direction code also equal to true? And true, I don't know well obviously it's a boolean, so you don't see the actual values, but true equals outgoing, false equals incoming. So if the email router or server-side sync was collecting messages or people were tracking them, the direction code would be equal to false. So if that's true, we then need to basically replace the description with a version of itself that had all the HTML tags stripped out. So it's just a case of setting, we'll do doing two steps. We'll do a string, excuse me, I'm hitting tab by mistake. Do a new string called new email description, and that is equal to, and we need to obviously come up with a method that will strip out the HTML tags. I have found one online. I'll post a link to credit the original author, where it's basically just a series of regular expressions doing a sort of a replace on the message, so looking for the different elements that make up a typical HTML message. So there's the headers and so on, and scripts and bodies and all the different special characters, and basically sequentially going through, stripping out each of those and replacing them with typically an empty string, or it could be a new line if it was a break, like so that represents in HTML like a new a break, or there's paragraphs like /p and stuff. I'm not an expert on HTML, as you can probably tell, but we need to replace those various tags with nothing, and the text within them in some cases. So obviously if it's a script tag surrounding a load of JavaScript, we don't just want to replace the script tags, we want to replace we will basically erase all the text within the script. So so I've got on the clipboard a function, a method that I found a guy online had already written, which I'll credit in the description. So if I go beneath so there's the opening brace of my execute method. So beneath that, if I paste in, so I'll just go to the top of it. So the methods, it's got a return type of a string. It's called strip. We could call it strip HTML or whatever you like. Takes a single parameter, which is a string type called source. It's got a try catch block, sets up a new string type called result, and then there's just a series of, he's nicely annotated it. There's a series of basically replace methods using regular expressions. Obviously, he hasn't. I think you could obviously add the namespace in, so you wouldn't have to have. But he's obviously fully declared it, so it doesn't require an extra using statement at the top. But anyway, it's a series of replaces, so it's looking for carriage returns and replacing them with a space, new line, replacing them with spaces, and so on, and tabs, and replacing with a string.empty, removing repeating spaces using a regular expression, removing the header, so anything that's got a head tag and a slash head, and so on. So looking the same for scripts, styles, so any kind of inline styles. And then I think it inserts line breaks in place of BRs and LI tags. Again, Ps adds a double line break. So it's basically just a series of these, just substituting a certain regular expression that represents those different types, and replacing with alternatives. So it's like double returns. Yeah, it's as simple as that, really. I mean, obviously the guys must have spent some time through trial and error to work out all the different tags and special characters and so on, and copyright symbols and whatnot. And then I think it replaces new lines with returns as well. But that's essentially it. And then right at the end, once it's done all that, it's constantly updating this result. It returns that. And I think if it doesn't, for any reason fails, returns the original HTML, so you wouldn't end up with losing your message. But obviously, if you wondered what had happened, it might be something to do with one of these regular expressions. But yeah, so it's a case of me calling that now when I'm placing this declaring this new email description. I need to call that strip method and pass in the current description. So pass in whatever the current HTML version is, and it will set it into this string in memory. We would then need to write that back, but what I'll do is I'll deploy this. We'll set up an email message, and we'll put a breakpoint in, and we'll have a look at what the message currently contains with all the markup and so on. So if I right click and deploy, so that should now be deployed against the email message on a create or an update once it finishes deploying. So that's now deployed. If I look at my solution, look at my message processing steps, I can see there's a create and an update, both pre-operation. On the primary object type is the email entity. So I'll put a breakpoint just up here. Mine's set to be sandbox, so I need to attach to the sandbox worker processes. So if I find the wrong machine, so that's my virtual server for CRM. So if I scroll down, at the moment it hasn't actually got a worker process running. So what I might do, I could trigger it once, but obviously then it'll mess up the message we're trying to test with. I'll change this to be non-sandbox for now, so we can just attach to the W3WP executable, which is a single process, because you can get up to 4 or possibly more than that at times, some like parallel sandbox processes, and obviously if you've attached to 1 or 2 of them and then 2 more get created by the back end, you're not attached to those, and they could execute your plugin against them, and it wouldn't hit your breakpoint because it would be executing on a thread that you're not attached to. So I think that's deployed. So if I attach again, but this time on my virtual server, if I scroll right down and find the W3WP attached to that, so just hide that out of the way. So I'm now attached to W3WP. If I go into CRM and go to just activity somewhere and create a new message, so if I create a new email, so the to and stuff at this point aren't relevant because we're just going to save it in a draft state, but we can so test email HTML subject, again not particularly relevant. Outgoing, and we need to set the sender's plain text so that it fulfills the criteria of our business logic. So what I'll do is just put a bit of text in, maybe change the font, the size, the colour, just so we know it's got something that's not plain text. Very imaginative here. Again, just pick a couple of random lovely green. So we've effectively got a message now that's HTML. That's what this HTML designer does out the box. And when we save it, we should break into our code. So now we've entered our breakpoint. Let me just move this out of the way. In fact, I'll hide that and that. So we're now converting to a early bound type. Because it iterates over our preent. Sorry, this is on a create, so it would contain it. So it contains sender's email. Sender's plain text, sorry, true, direction code true. And then if we look at the description as it stands, we can see, if I bring it up we can see all the tags surrounding the fonts and so on. There's some of the message in plain text. Again, more breaks and divs and so on. And if we see the return type from that, so it's now got test email message, return, more text is what so that's what the description's been replaced with. So it's stripped out all the HTML formatting. Obviously this isn't writing anything back to CRM, so if I continue, nothing. If that wasn't obviously stepping in and breaking through our code, we'd have done it, and it looks exactly the same. So now what we need to do is detach from that and add a single extra line, which is merely email description equals the new email description. So the string, the plain text contained within there, we're now just taking what was stripped out. So we stripped out all the HTML tagging into a in-memory string, and now we're going to write that back to the description property of the email message, and because it's pre-operation, it will then commit that on the main database operation without us having to do any kind of service.update. So if I deploy again, take a few seconds. So what I'll step in again, because now we're going to update the same message. So just to prove that, in fact, what I'll do is just put a breakpoint up here, conscious that we only get 2 minutes when we're stepping into code, so we need to be conscious of that and not spend too long analysing it, because it will throw a platform exception if we take longer than 2 minutes for the message to complete. So attached to W3WP again. Obviously it's no symbols loaded because we've got a new version that we've deployed, and it will, as we edit the message again, it calls the plugin, it will obviously load the correct symbols. So I'll just edit the description because that's the only thing we've triggered the update on. I'll just put some rubbish in, hit save. That should step into our... it didn't hit the breakpoint, but you can see what it's done is it's stripped out all of the formatting. The reason it appears to be on a single line is because this is a HTML designer and viewer. So /r and /n that are sort of standard plain text representations of new lines or carriage returns don't get rendered as such. So that is actually, as you saw when we looked at the plain text that was in the message, in the property in memory, does contain it. This window here that's a HTML designer doesn't render those as new lines. That's where they would have to have the left bracket BR or /P for paragraph to do a line break. I was trying to test earlier whether sending one out, but I can't get my server-side sync working. But if I actually send one to say and then read it in Outlook, does it recognise the /r and put it on a new line? But at the moment, I say it's. Let me just try putting it onto Notepad. No. So I don't know if it has stripped it out and CRM's removed it, or whether when you actually do send it out of CRM, whether it would actually be rendered correctly in, say, Outlook or another, or Gmail or whatever your chosen email client is. Yeah, I don't know why that didn't break in. Let me just do a clean rebuild and redeploy. Sometimes when I get it not hitting breakpoints, I have to do a sort of rebuild, which cleans it all and republish. So let me just attach again. So again, W3WP, attach. I'll go in here, I'll change some of this to back to, so it's got some HTML formatting again. And then we save. Yeah, so it's hit it this time. So you can see at the pre-entity image, it hits that piece of code for the update, checks obviously entity. If we look at the attributes collection, it'll probably only contain the updated description. So it's got an updated description, a couple of modified ons and so on, but not the 2 fields we need. So it iterates over adding those in, and after that, obviously we can look at the attribute collection again, and it contains our sends plain text and our direction code from the pre-entity image. And again, if we look at this again, there's the one with all the different paragraphs and test email. If we look at what, so it's going to write in a couple of new lines and so on, but we'd need to check. In fact, if we do this, edit it slightly and send it out again. So if I just put a couple of extra letters, save, remove that breakpoint. Yeah, so it's the strip code. I think it's replaced it with new lines. So it is doing it. I would have to test actually sending it out of the system to ensure that it has actually put that on another email client, it would actually render it correctly and actually put the line breaks and the new lines. But that's essentially what was asked for. Let me just check. I don't want to get Marcus. Yeah, it was Marcus. Didn't want to get the name wrong. That was essentially what Marcus asked about earlier. You could obviously also use this inbound to strip out the information. Maybe you want to store the messages as plain text rather than HTML formatted anyway, or write them to other record types or cases or whatever, and put it inside the description or add it to the notes and not have all the HTML markup. But thank you for watching. I'm going to do another video a bit later on to do with data types, because that was asked a little while back, and a week or two ago a chap, Paul, I think, asked, and I just hadn't got round to recording it really. So thanks for watching, and see you all again soon.